Well, I think all of us were pleased to see Emily Damari emerge. And of course, we have been in touch with the Damari family. And as the Honourable Gentleman would expect, we have also been in touch with UNRWA. This was raised by the Development Secretary with Mr. Lazzarini directly, who have instigated an investigation.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The same tactics as we've seen in Gaza by the Israeli forces are now being used in the West Bank, which is the forced displacement of communities and use of heavy weapons against civilians. What's the government's response to this, both to Israel and also to the UN? Isn't this time that we responded to the advisory opinion?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raises a very serious issue. As I have said repeatedly at this dispatch box, I condemn the expansion that we have seen over this last period, and I condemn the violence that we have seen over this last period, and I reject those who call for annexation of the West Bank. I met with Tom Fletcher of the UN very recently to discuss these very same issues and renewed our commitment to OCHA, the humanitarian work that's important, and of course at this time I've been in touch with both the Israelis and Prime Minister Mustafa as we discuss these issues together.
Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in 17th of October 2023, when the first hospital was bombed in Palestine, the Al-Ahil Arab Mosque, much conversation was had that who could have committed such a heinous crime. Since then, the Israeli army has destroyed all medical facilities in Gaza, and now we have a president in the United States using gangster-style intimidation to forcibly remove the Palestinian people from their land. Will the minister now, who has repeatedly refused to call out the Israeli government for the war crimes it's committing, refused to ban all arms sales, and refused to acknowledge a genocide is happening, and even to consider economic sanctions because £6.1 billion is a too high price to pay, accept the reality of the situation and accept that Trump and Netanyahu plan proposes ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Can I just say to everybody, we're well under time. I just need to get a lot of the members in. Foreign Secretary.
We're in the first phase of a ceasefire I want to hold and to go to phase 2. That is the issue I was discussing with Arab leaders last week at the Munich Security Conference, the Quint group that are working with President Trump to get to that third phase and the governance issues that will be so important with the Palestinian Authority involved in Gaza.
Shadow Foreign Secretary, pretty.
My thoughts continue to be with the hostages held in Gaza and the appalling suffering they and their families are facing. The world has seen the brutality inflicted by the Iranian-sponsored terrorist Hamas, who are a major obstacle to bringing about a sustainable and just peace in the Middle East. Now, the Foreign Secretary has previously agreed there cannot be any future whatsoever for Hamas controlling Gaza. So can he provide an update on the actions that he has undertaken to put an end to Hamas control, to ensure that we get to the third phase of the ceasefire, and to whether or not he'll be discussing this particular issue when he goes to America with the Prime Minister and meets the President of the United States?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and I can confirm that I discussed this issue with Ron Dermer last week from the Israeli government. I discussed this issue with Arab leaders, the Quint, so-called Quint, the week before. In the end, we cannot have a Gaza run by Hamas. All roads lead back to Hamas. And I might say, I think the world has looked with horror at the scenes of armed men wearing bandanas, seeming to glorify murder and hostages that have been held. And of course, we will act with international colleagues to make sure that Hamas has no role to play in the future of Gaza.
All Davis.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Investments in the Global Fund, UNITAID, UNAIDS, the WHO and others have helped to cut new HIV infections by 60% since 1995 and AIDS-related deaths by 69% since 2004. I was pleased to meet HIV-positive activists in Parliament recently and to be videoed while undertaking a quick and easy HIV test. Together, we can eradicate HIV/AIDS. Thank you.
All Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is aware that PEPFAR is the largest and most successful global health programme and has saved 25 million lives. It's been advised that freezing PEPFAR will result in 228,000 fewer HIV tests being carried out daily. UNAIDS predicts 6.3 million AIDS-related deaths will occur if PEPFAR lacks funding for the next 5 years. Can the Minister ensure that the Foreign Office includes HIV in all international discussions, especially at the G7 in Canada this year?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tests and treatment are absolutely critical, and I'm pleased that the Prime Minister recently announced that, together with South Africa, the UK will co-host the 8th replenishment of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. The Global Fund is the leading financier of the global fight against HIV/AIDS, and we will work with Canada to draw attention to the importance of the Global Fund replenishment at the G7. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask specifically what details in terms of financing will be given to the Global Fund coming up. And more importantly, there's been a rumour just now that official development assistance is going to be cut from 0.5 to 0.2% to cover for an increase in defence spending. Can the Minister confirm if this is the case?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I believe the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise the importance of funding for global health. Of course, this is not just important for those directly impacted, it's important for us here in our country, because we know that diseases do not respect borders. I set out a few moments ago, Mr. Speaker, the fact that we are committed, the Prime Minister is committed to that Global Fund replenishment, and rightly so. Thank you.
Lord Hatton.
Question number 3, please, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
The overseas territories, including the British Virgin Islands, work to uphold international standards on tax transparency, illicit finance and enforce UK sanctions. The overseas territories agreed to implement corporate registers accessible to at least those with legitimate interests by June 2025. We're aware of BVI's public consultation on its register, and we're working with them to improve their proposal.
Lord Hatton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The BVI, as was said, will soon close the consultation on their proposal to grant only limited access to a register of beneficial ownership. This proposal means that it would be virtually impossible for even a select few to trace those using the BVI as a place to secretly stash their cash. And this all comes some 5 years after the first deadline to set up a register was missed. I know that the Minister agrees that sunlight is the best disinfectant when it comes to combating illicit finance. So could the Minister outline what steps he is taking to ensure that the BVI establish a genuine and fully transparent register of beneficial ownership?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that the BVI did commit at the Joint Ministerial Council to improve access to their corporate register by June. I met with them at that time, or just after that. The state will be meeting with the BVI again in the coming weeks. It's important that that public consultation on their proposed register closes this Friday, and we're working with them to improve their proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will be aware that under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, Clause 6, the British Virgin Islands are obliged to introduce open registers of beneficial ownership by the end of 2020 or be subject to an order in Council. They have not done so. They are in contempt of Parliament. When will he issue the order in Council?
I mean, let me just say to the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, if the agreed requirements are not met, we will carefully consider what further steps to take. Our expectation remains very clear that these registers will ultimately be public, and my honourable friend, the Minister of State, is meeting with BVI to make very clear what our expectations are.
Roberts.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 5 and 23 together. Settler violence is unacceptable. On the 15th of October, the UK sanctioned 3 outposts and 4 entities linked to violence in the West Bank under the global human rights regime. These measures will help bring accountability to those who have supported and perpetrated such heinous abuses of human rights. The government does not comment on future sanctions measures, as to do so would reduce their impact.
Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Comments made yesterday by the UN General Secretary about increasing violence in the West Bank by Israeli settlers have shocked my Bath constituents and indeed people across the country and indeed across the House. We are frustrated by the lack of action. Will the government actually sanction those who advocate for this violence, especially Minister Smotrich and former Minister Ben-Gvir?
Mr. Speaker, we've condemned the unacceptable language that has been used by Israeli Minister Bezalel Smotrich and the former Minister Mr. Ben-Gvir. The Foreign Secretary and all of the ministers have been clear with their Israeli counterparts that the Israeli government must clamp down on settler violence, as the Foreign Secretary said earlier, and end the settlement expansion. As I said in my original answer, we will not comment on future sanctions. To do so could reduce their impact.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Freeman East Somerset, many people are very passionate about resolving the situation between Israel and Palestine. And there are concerns that violence in the West Bank has increased and that illegal settlements have continued to expand. Does the Minister not agree with me that if he also wants to see a reduction in settler violence, we should be considering sanctioning these settlements?
Mr. Speaker, I am seriously concerned by the expansion of Israel's operations in the West Bank. 40,000 Palestinians have reportedly been displaced. Palestinians must be allowed home. Civilians must be protected and the destruction of civilian infrastructure minimised. Stability is essential at this crucial time. We recognise Israel's security concerns, but it must show restraint and ensure its operations are commensurate to the threat posed. And I refer to my previous answer on sanctions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel has sent tanks to the West Bank for the first time in 20 years. 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced from refugee camps there. The very least that should be done to stop these contraventions of international law is to impose a ban on Israeli goods coming from illegal Israeli settlements. Minister, isn't it now the time to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We call for trade to be done in the proper way. There are clear provisions around where Israeli goods are produced. We do not recognise illegal settlements, and goods produced there must be properly labelled, and there is clear advice to business on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government and its partners are doing important work to support the continuation of the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. But in the West Bank, as well as increased settler attacks, we've seen Israeli forces attack a Palestinian bookshop in East Jerusalem, UNRWA schools closed, tanks moving into refugee camps, and the forced displacement of some 40,000 Palestinians. What action is the government taking to prevent the Gazaisation of the West Bank?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous answer, we are following events in the West Bank closely. Stability in the West Bank is crucial to ensure the fragile ceasefire in Gaza can last. All sides should work to ensure a lowering of tension in the West Bank at this time. It is in no one's interest for further conflict and instability to spread in the West Bank.
Friend of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
A week ago, I was in a Palestinian village with colleagues, including the Honourable General for Rochdale, opposite, and we went to a school which had been demolished by illegal settlers, and immediately two punks turned up with submachine guns, intimidating us. This is happening all over the place. We went to Hebron. Hebron is completely closed down. This is appalling. The whole House should unite against these extremist Jewish settlers and the illegal settlements, because it is not in the interest of moderate Israeli opinion. It is directly contrary to peace, and we must fight this.
Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House and my neighbour can hear from this side of the House the strong support for his remarks.
Paul Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Father of the House just referenced, I was in Israel and the West Bank last week, and there were two things became instantly clear. One was widespread revulsion at the Hamas sickening desecration of the bodies of Israeli hostages, but also widespread fear amongst Palestinians, particularly in the Palestinians in the rural areas that we met, who have first-hand experience of their children having stones thrown at them by settlers, their neighbours having their cars torched, and their own windscreens being smashed every night. So can the government reassure us that these extremist settlers are going to be dealt with really, really thoroughly in any foreign policy that we have?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with my honourable friend in some of the horrific scenes that have come out of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in recent weeks, and I restate our opposition to a further expansion of extremist settler violence and indeed illegal settlements.
Gagan Mahindra.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I'll answer questions 6 and 13 together. Mr. Speaker, we remain committed to concluding a deal which protects the base on Diego Garcia. Without a deal, the base cannot operate in practical terms as it should in its important role protecting the security of this country, the United States and our allies. We're currently discussing the agreement with the US and Mauritius. We won't put a deadline on its finalisation and will come to the House in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The determination of the party opposite to give away vital strategic territory in the Chagos Islands, seemingly to satisfy one of the Prime Minister's loyal friends over our American allies, is baffling to my colleagues and this side of the House. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's far more important that we maintain our special relationship with the US and the new Trump administration than paying billions of pounds in the face of self-inflicted worsening economic situation here domestically to give the Chinese government access to this vital region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are so many things in his question I disagree with. I don't know quite where to start. But what I will say, we are not giving away the base on Diego Garcia. This secures the base on Diego Garcia. And if there was not a problem with its operation and its future, why did his government start negotiations on it?
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that the Chinese have a smart city situated in Mauritius. So what safeguards are there in this deal to prevent Chinese installations on Diego Garcia, which could compromise the safety of Western naval security?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, the right honourable gentleman, for his question. We are absolutely clear that we will retain full control over Diego Garcia with robust provisions to keep adversaries out, including unrestricted access to and use of the base for the UK and the US, a buffer zone around Diego Garcia, a comprehensive mechanism to ensure no activity in the outer islands threatens base operations, and a ban on the presence of any foreign security forces. So I can absolutely assure him that the provisions are in place to defend the security of that critical base.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you. The Foreign Secretary has proudly said that his Chagos surrender plan was a good deal and told the Foreign Affairs Committee in November that it was a very good deal, and he was confident that the Mauritians are still sure about that, and that was back in November. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Mauritius told his National Assembly that since his election, he concluded the deal was so bad, we said no way, and that he had extracted more concessions from the UK on the length of the lease, extension on sovereignty and, Mr. Speaker, the costs. So can the Minister confirm that changes have been made since that announcement of the deal on the 3rd of October last year? And does he disagree with the account given by the Prime Minister of Mauritius?
Mr. Speaker, the fundamentals of the deal remain the same and the overall quantum remains unchanged.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 7, please.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We condemn the Taliban's appalling treatment of women and girls in Afghanistan. The Taliban must reverse their barbaric decrees, and we keep working hard with international partners to maintain collective pressure.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The cruelty and inhumanity of the Taliban should appall us all, and no doubt we do all condemn the ban on medical training. The UK has provided significant levels of aid to Afghanistan to support the health of women and babies. But with the Taliban now undermining women's health as well as their rights, what will happen to these aid programmes and funds, and what actions can be taken by us to put pressure on the Taliban to reverse their decision?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And she's absolutely right that the Taliban have been undermining so much of women's lives and that of girls as well in Afghanistan. We are determined to support girls in Afghanistan. That includes when it comes to education. I've directly discussed this with the Aga Khan Foundation to ensure that that support is getting directly to girls. But we also need to push hard politically as well. And I was very pleased, Mr. Speaker, to be able to announce that the UK is politically supporting the initiative to refer Afghanistan to the International Court of Justice for violations of CEDAW. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Wendy Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The treatment of women and girls by the Taliban is disgusting, and pressure must be exerted in response. The Minister will know there are concerns about the future protections of rights for women and girls and other minorities in Syria too, given the ideology of HGS. Ministers have issued a statement on the future of the UK sanctions on Syria, so can she provide details on the measures that need to be put in place in Syria as well to protect these rights, and whether issues such as this will be tied to future decisions on sanctions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her question and indeed her passion around these issues of the protection of women and girls. Those issues around the protection of women and girls and indeed religious and ethnic minorities have been at the core of the UK's engagement with the Syrian authorities. They were at the core of the interventions that I made at the conference on Syria in Paris that I attended just a few days ago, and they are also, of course, very important when it comes to the changes around sanctions that my right honourable friend set out. Thank you.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, myself and the Minister of the Cabinet Office are engaging extensively with European counterparts. This includes the Prime Minister's first attendance at a European Council since Brexit. We are working closely with European allies, calling for increased defence spending and support for Ukraine, and the deeper engagement has already delivered results on growth and security, including a landmark defence and migration agreement with Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Thames Valley is one of the most important economic zones of this country. At a recent meeting I held with the business leaders of the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, the overwhelming message was that Brexit has been a disaster for business and Boris Johnson and the Tories did them dirty. Will the Minister commit to correcting that wrong and start negotiations to join a customs union with the European Union?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that we do not seek to rejoin the customs union, but I will be clear that our cooperation is already delivering results, particularly in relation to growth and business. We recently secured a £250 million Czech investment in Rolls-Royce small modular nuclear reactors, a further £600 million investment by Polish firm InPost into their UK operations, and we've also signed deals on migration, as I said, with Serbia, Kosovo, Slovenia and Slovakia.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine are underway, whatever your opinion of them is. But the eager eye of Putin may now look to other former Soviet countries like the Baltic states. I was in Estonia a couple of weeks ago. The distance between the Russian border and the Russian-held Kaliningrad territory is just 300 miles. For context, that's roughly what I travel every week to Plymouth from here. So what steps is the government taking to deter the Russians from looking at that possible future military action there?
Well, as I said, Mr. Speaker, security is absolutely at the heart of our engagement with European counterparts, and the UK's commitment to the Baltic states' security is ironclad. We're helping to uphold the region's security through our NATO forward land forces deployment in Estonia. The Prime Minister met Jeff leaders in Tallinn in December to discuss closer cooperation in response not only to conventional threats and Russian aggression, but also hybrid threats, and of course our work together on Ukraine. And I've visited that border myself. I've met our enhanced forward presence troops there. They're doing an absolutely excellent job, and it is crucial that we stand with our Baltic neighbours and all of Europe in our collective security.
Wendy Morton, Shadow Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK can be proud of the leadership shown in supporting Ukraine and rallying our international partners around this cause. I'd like to ask the Minister if he can tell us what work he's leading with European allies on unfreezing sanctioned assets to equip Ukraine, and what his timeframe is for releasing critical sanctioned funds to strengthen Europe's defence of our values, security and defence.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She knows the important work we've already done working with European partners to secure that extraordinary revenue acceleration loan, and that will make a tangible difference to Ukraine. We continue to work with European partners on sanctions, and of course we're considering all lawful options forward. We've had important discussions in the Weimar Group and through the G7, and we'll continue to look at all options to support Ukraine with European counterparts.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Colin Miller.
Mr. Speaker. It was shocking yesterday to see the United States vote with the despots of North Korea, Belarus and Russia against a UN resolution proposed by the UK and other European democracies. Liberal Democrats want to see the UK lead in Europe against Putin's war on Ukraine. So we were pleased to hear the Foreign Secretary yesterday say that he was taking forward our Liberal Democrat proposal that the £40 billion of frozen Russian assets held in European central banks should be seized and given to Ukraine. Can the Minister confirm the Foreign Secretary will push the US administration to join this initiative when he visits Washington later this week?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely glad of the continued cross-party cooperation on Ukraine, as we saw in the Foreign Secretary's statement yesterday, and of course that includes getting important resources. I'm not quite sure it was a Liberal Democrat proposal, but I think there's a united front across this House to get Ukraine the resources that it needs. We will continue to work with European counterparts in support of Ukraine in the United Nations, across Europe, through NATO, and through all means that we can support them militarily, economically and diplomatically.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Who wants it? Minister, well done.
Mr. Speaker, apologies. I'm answering a lot of questions today. On the question of Georgia, Mr. Speaker, I have significant concerns about the Georgian authorities' violent crackdown on peaceful demonstrators and indeed journalists. It's completely unacceptable. And in response, we have suspended programme support to the Georgian government. We've restricted defence cooperation and we've limited engagement with Georgian Dream. We've imposed visa bans and sanctions on some of those responsible for the violence. And we continue to work with international partners to support a free and open civil society and media in Georgia.
Whereas, Mr. Speaker, last month at the Council of Europe, I met several Georgian opposition members. They showed me graphic evidence of the brutal physical abuse meted out at the hands of the Georgian regime before, during and since the recent parliamentary elections. Bidzina Ivanishvili, the Putin-backed oligarch and de facto ruler of Georgia, continues to suppress peaceful process using an identical modus operandi that is used in Russia. Violence and intimidation are distorting the political process. The United States has imposed sanctions on Ivanishvili, but much of Ivanishvili's wealth is based in the UK or British overseas territories. Will the Minister commit to the UK joining our allies and freezing the assets of such a despicable tyrant?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first thank him and his fellow members of the PACE delegation for the important work they're doing, including on this issue of Georgia. It's hugely important that we stand together with fellow Europeans in the Council of Europe on these matters. In coordination with the US, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions, as I said, against the Minister and Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and 3 police chiefs responsible for violence attacks against journalists and peaceful protesters in Georgia. He will understand that while we continue to closely monitor the evolving situation in Georgia, we do not comment on potential future sanctions designations, as to do so would lessen their impact.
Mr. Speaker, the European Parliament recently recognised Salome Zurabishvili as the rightful president of Georgia. The protesters on the streets of Tbilisi day in, day out agree with that view. She's met with President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and she attended the recent inauguration of the US President. Will the Minister commit to meeting with Madame Zurabishvili next time she visits the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we continue to engage with a range of figures in Georgia. We continue to engage with all of those who seek a Euro-Atlantic path for Georgia, as indeed is defined in their own constitution and the wishes of their people, and we'll continue to work closely with European counterparts on that issue.
Number 10,
Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The slave trade was abhorrent. We recognise its horrific impacts and the ongoing strength of feeling, but there have been no such discussions. As the Foreign Secretary made clear to the Foreign Affairs Committee after Chogam, in his words, there was no discussion about reparation and money, and the Prime Minister and I were absolutely clear that we will not be making cash transfers and payments to the Caribbean. We are focused, Mr. Speaker, on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring... No problem, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, we are focused on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring challenges of today and the future, including security, growth and climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week saw the 38th Ordinary Session of the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government, the topic of which was justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Caribbean Heads of State were also present, and we know that CARICOM have long engaged in discussions on reparative justice. Whether we participate in these discussions or not, they will continue to happen. Does the Minister accept that the world and its power structures are changing, and in our turbulent post-Brexit reality, we need allies and friends, but we won't even say that we are sorry, and we'll be foolish to think that we are not deeply resented for this? Is it not better for the UK to engage in these discussions to ensure that we actually play a constructive role in addressing the enduring legacies of slavery and colonialism?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We recognise that this is an issue of enduring concern to many. We do listen to views from our Caribbean partners on the full range of bilateral issues, but our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. We are determined to work together for the future.
Objective.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Quick question. To what extent does the government support CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparatory justice?
As I just stated, Mr Speaker, our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question 11.
Foreign Secretary.
Ending the conflict in Sudan is a personal priority for me, Mr Speaker. I recently visited the Ardre border with the Chadian Foreign Minister to increase international attention on Sudan and meet with Sudanese civilians who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. I'm very happy to announce that I will be convening foreign ministers in London in April around the second anniversary of the outbreak of the civil war in Sudan to foster international consensus on a path to ending the conflict.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank the Foreign Secretary for all that he is doing. Like so many conflicts, the discourse over this brutal Sudanese war is being fuelled by external actors to Sudan, with economic and mineral interest in the country, as well as wider geopolitical agitation. Interest of countries like Russia, like Egypt with its support for the SAF, and the UAE ARC with support for the RSF, and the wider use of mercenaries. So what further steps can the Foreign Secretary take to use our leverage, not least our trading leverage, to ensure that actors are not fuelling this horrendous war and humanitarian crisis?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be pleased that I raised these issues at the G20 in my contribution. I had a lengthy discussion with Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, with the Foreign Minister of Angola and with President Ramaphosa on the situation in Sudan. I'm looking forward to convening this conference in London, working with the French and with the African Union. And I hope that all international partners, we continue to emphasise the importance of this, of refraining from actions that prolong the conflict.
Okay, Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State has indicated that he's going to have further discussions along with the African Union, given that there are about 9 million people displaced in what is one of the most, if not the most, significant humanitarian catastrophe the world faces today. Can he impress upon the African Union and partners the need for urgent action to try and resolve this?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and I didn't just go to the Ardre crossing to spend time with the overwhelming women and children who are fleeing this conflict, but it was important also to announce £20 million in additional support to refugees, and particularly access to reproductive and sexual health services on that border. It's grim, it's horrific, it's had too little attention, and I intend to do all we can to bring this to an end.
Andrew Pegs.
Number 12, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 28th of January, we announced a further £17 million for healthcare, food and shelter, and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories. This was an investment in the ceasefire, which must hold. Thank you.
Andrew Pegs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is utterly heartbreaking seeing the desecration of hostages' bodies, but also seeing men, women and children return to Gaza to try and rebuild their lives amongst the rubble. So can I welcome the government's efforts on humanitarian aid in this fragile ceasefire, a ceasefire that risks becoming even more fragile with tanks rolling into the West Bank. Can the Minister update the House on what more we can do to ensure the ceasefire is implemented in full and that we also protect human rights and communities in the West Bank?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I know that many across the House will share his revulsion and concern at those scenes. We are committed to working with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US and regional partners to build confidence in the ceasefire, support conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace, including Palestinian reconstruction as well. To support immediate needs, Mr Speaker, £2 million of the recently announced funding has been committed to critical water and energy infrastructure projects. Thank you.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read the House to my register of interests. I recently visited Israel as part of a delegation from this place and met politicians from across the political spectrum. Some support the current Israeli government's approach, others do not. But what unites them is criticism of the UK government's continued support of UNRWA. Will the government please reconsider support of UNRWA?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. I have also had those discussions both in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. And I do recognise that there was, of course, particularly concern around the events that led to the production of the colonial report, really disturbing allegations of involvement of UNRWA staff. As was mentioned previously, there are also concerns around reports that Emily Damari may have been placed within an UNRWA camp. We have taken this up with UNRWA. We indeed have supported them around their reform agenda. They have delivered change, and they are the only organisation that can deliver the humanitarian support that is desperately needed right now for millions of Palestinians. Thank you.
Question number 14.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We remain desperately concerned about the humanitarian situation in Sudan. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, set out the measures that have been taken by the UK to seek to ameliorate that appalling disaster, which has included a doubling of aid to Sudan.
I think the book, Minister, the group.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. I'm taking the group 14, 16 and 21. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. In recent days, Sudanese army forces have advanced into El Abed, the capital of North Kordofan state, ending a 2-year siege by the Rapid Support Forces. This has caused serious food shortages within North Kordofan, being deemed to be suffering conditions under the Integrated Food Security Phase classification. Please, could the Minister confirm what the government is doing to ensure aid is fast-tracked into the city?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this because the situation she describes is intolerable. I was very grateful to international counterparts who attended a discussion on these subjects that we took part in the Munich Security Conference. She talked about the famine designation. We regret the fact that the SAF has now indicated it will not cooperate with assessment of famine, but of course we've seen both the RSF and the SAF restricting aid, using it as a weapon of war. That must end.
Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Genocide 8020 campaign group at Hampton School in my constituency recently met with members of the Darfur diaspora who fled the atrocities in Sudan. They would like to know what the UK government is doing to help those targeted simply for who they are. So, Mr. Speaker, with a staggering 16 million children desperately needing food, shelter, healthcare and education, could I ask the Minister for assurances that we won't see any cuts to UK aid to the region, and what assessment she has made of the impact of the Trump administration's cuts to US aid?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. She's right to raise some of the disturbing accounts of atrocities that we have heard, and she will be pleased to know that the UK led efforts to renew the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission mandate in October of last year. I was very pleased to see additional African countries coming on board with that. We have doubled our aid to Sudan, Mr. Speaker, so that commitment is not in doubt. Thank you.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's pushing ceasefire in Sudan and doubling aid. Sudan's civil war, now in its 3rd year, has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises of the decade, with 5.1 million internally displaced and 1.3 million seeking refugees since April 2023, and famine now looming. Given this, can the Minister outline what urgent steps the government is taking with their international counterparts to help de-escalate the conflict in Sudan?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ending the conflict in Sudan and the appalling consequences of it is a UK priority. Both the Foreign Secretary and I have visited the region, including Chad and South Sudan. We have increased aid. We have been determined to increase international attention. That includes the April conference that the Foreign Secretary referred to, but also the fact that I convened development ministers from a number of countries a few days ago with the Emergency Relief Coordinator to try and pile on the pressure.
Seamus Logan. Mr. Speaker, the last time the Minister was in front of the House talking about Sudan,
She told us that it was important to have trust in the international system. Given that the RSF, accused of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and so far acting with complete impunity, have just pledged to form a rival government, what is the UK government doing to garner this trust in the international system and to hold them to account?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regret that we see both parties to the conflict behaving in a manner that is having a truly catastrophic impact on civilians. We see famine, we see appalling levels of conflict-related sexual violence, and the international community must step up. That is indeed why the Foreign Secretary is seeking to convene leaders around this in April. It's why I've pulled together development ministers on this. It's why we've repeatedly raised these issues at the UN as well.
Question 15, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UK government is committed to human rights in Sri Lanka and is leading international efforts to promote accountability in human rights, including at the UN Human Rights Council. And at a visit last month to Sri Lanka, I raised these issues with ministers of the new government in Colombo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is over 15 years since the end of the bloody civil war in Sri Lanka. Those responsible for the many war crimes committed during that conflict, including targeting of civilians and sexual violence, have still not been held accountable. In opposition, the Foreign Secretary called out on the government to follow the example of our allies, including the US and Canada, in imposing sanctions against individuals suspected of committing those appalling acts. Now he's in government, will he commit to finally doing so?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October of 2024, the UK and our core group partners led a resolution on Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council outlining just what he is saying, renewing the mandate of the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to report regularly on Sri Lanka to protect and preserve evidence to use in future accountability processes. And we consider a range of justice and accountability options, including sanctions, and keep evidence and any potential designations under close review.
Right, we come to topicals. Alison Bennett.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
As I set out in the House yesterday, securing a lasting peace that safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty for the long term is essential. To achieve this, Europe and the United States must provide the support Ukraine needs to stay strong. Ukraine must be at the heart of any talks. The UK is playing a leading role on assistance to Ukraine, on pressure on Russia, and on keeping our allies united.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government bring forward emergency legislation to seize frozen Russian assets and ensure they are repurposed to support Ukraine in the wake of Trump's talks with Putin? And if not, could the Foreign Secretary explain why not?
The Honourable Lady raises an important issue. It's not an issue on which any government can act alone. We must act with European allies. It was a topic of conversation at the G7. It was a topic of conversation at the Weimar Group. And of course, Europe has to act quickly. And I believe we should move from freezing assets to seizing assets.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Gaza ceasefire deal remains fragile, and as we enter the final week of the ceasefire's first phase, it's crucial that both the Israeli and Palestinian governments continue to uphold the agreement and reunite families with dignity. Can the Minister assure me that this government will continue to support the ceasefire deal into its remaining stages and work with international partners such as Jordan and Egypt to secure a lasting peace?
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that we will continue to support the ceasefire deal through all three of its phases, which we hope to see concluded in full. And I'm working with international partners, as are other ministers, and I saw the Jordanian and Egyptian ambassadors on this question just last week.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
This House stands united with the people of Ukraine. So in light of Putin's brutality towards the people of Ukraine, what discussions will the Foreign Secretary be having with allies, including his American counterparts, on the international effort to prosecute Russia for invading Ukraine and the sheer barbarism that they have inflicted upon the people of Ukraine?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for raising the issue of justice and accountability. And she knows this work begun, of course, under the last government, that we led the world in ensuring that there were sufficient funds in Ukraine, and the Foreign Office does support lawyers working in Ukraine to gather that evidence. I'll never forget the scenes that I saw in Bucha and the victims that I've stood with. The UK will not let up on justice
And Putin should pay in terms of his accountability, not the British and European people.
Speaker, Russia, Iran, China all pose threats to Britain and they go out of their way to do us harm. So can the Foreign Secretary explain why the government has yet to implement the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, which the last government legislated for, and can he confirm when it will come in and whether or not China will be on the enhanced tier?
Well, she raises again an important issue. We inherited a process that wasn't quite working, and she knows these issues, and we will come forward shortly with our plans under the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ICJ delivered their advisory opinion last July and made it absolutely crystal clear that the illegal settlements at that time were just that, unlawful. And yet we have seen threats to displace Gazans, we've seen tanks in the West Bank. When will the government deliver their response to the advisory opinion, and will it be before the conference in Switzerland in a few weeks' time?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question and her long commitment to these issues. As I made clear during the Westminster Hall debate on the 12th February, UK respects the independence of the ICJ. We're considering the Court's advisory opinion with the rigour and the seriousness it deserves. We remain clear Israel should bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories as rapidly as possible, whilst making every effort to create the conditions for negotiations towards a two-state solution.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will be shocked to learn the worrying news that the mother of British-Egyptian political prisoner Alaa Abdel Fattah, Laila Suif, was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital last night. She's 68 years old and has been on hunger strike now for 149 days. Can the Foreign Secretary update us on whether the Prime Minister has now spoken to the Egyptian President to secure the release of Alaa Abdel Fattah and allow Laila to break her strike?
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House are engaged in this case, and we all are hoping for Laila's health. The Prime Minister met with Laila and the rest of her family recently, and I was pleased to join them. The Prime Minister has undertaken to take every effort that he can in order to try and ensure Allah's release, and we will continue to do so.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having recently returned from Camp Viking, the hub for UK commando forces in the High North, I witnessed the vital role it plays in our strategic defence efforts. Can I ask the Minister what engagement he's had with Norwegian counterparts to counter Russian aggression and strengthen our collective security in the region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was delighted he's visited those incredible commandos up there training. I too have visited them in the past, our Royal Marines and Army commandos in the High North in Norway, and I've witnessed the vital role that they play in our strategic defence efforts. The UK and Norway work closely together as NATO and JEF allies. Our Prime Minister signed a strategic partnership in December, and last week the Defence Secretary also visited Norway to launch a new agreement on deeper defence cooperation. Myself and the Foreign Secretary have also visited with our counterparts, and I can tell you that security and defence cooperation were absolutely at the heart of our efforts and our discussions with our Norwegian friends.
Monica Harley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump and Elon Musk slashing US aid was a great day for Russia and China. Will the Foreign Secretary avoid giving them another great day by committing to protect the UK's development budget, even as we raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, because he knows that preventing wars is cheaper than fighting them?
What can I say to the Honourable Lady? That I'm proud of the work that the UK has done over many decades in relation to development, the work that I've seen in Ukraine, the work that I've seen in Gaza, the work that I've seen in Sudan. All of this work will, of course, continue.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The security of Europe is absolutely paramount. Can the Secretary of State tell us what new steps he's taking to deter Russia from further invading European borders, given that we are now in a new situation with negotiations undergoing?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I was very pleased yesterday to announce one of the biggest sanction packages that this country has ever seen, to bear down further on Russia's shadow fleet. And I remind the honourable gentleman that interest rates are running at 21%, that inflation is running at 9%, we're doing a lot to take money off the table of Putin to fund his war machine.
Robin Swan.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. In January, the Foreign Office Minister said they would challenge the Northern Ireland Executive to be more robust in its reporting of international affairs and meetings. At the start of this month, the First and Deputy First Minister met again with the Chinese Consul, but still no details of that meeting has been reported or shared in our previous meetings. Has that challenge been made, and what was the response?
We regularly engage with Northern Ireland on all matters of foreign policy, and specifically in relation to the matter of Chinese consular issue. It's not really for ministers to discuss at the dispatch box.
Joe Powell.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the massive sanctions package announced yesterday by the government. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that China should be taking a significantly more proactive role in preventing its companies from supplying Russia's military?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his praise and support for the action we took, as the Foreign Secretary said. This is one of the largest package that we've done since the start of Russia's illegal and barbarous invasion. We are absolutely clear on the principle alongside our G7 allies that Russia must pay for the damage it is causing to Ukraine, and we of course look at third country routes in which support is being given to Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine, and we're taking a number of steps on that in that regard, including with companies in China. That was part of the package yesterday.
Donald Pinkerton.
Last week, the honourable member for Lincoln, the Minister for North Africa and the Middle East, left open the possibility that the FCDO might revisit the issue of explicit carbon monoxide warnings on FCDO travel advisory pages. A change that we contend that would have a cascading effect in the UK travel industry, would drive up the use of carbon monoxide alarms, would save lives of British travellers overseas. Can I encourage the front bench team, please, to pick up this issue in the name of my constituent Hudson Foley, to ensure that the lives of British travellers overseas are kept safe? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm I will be adding information to our dedicated page for independent travellers to highlight the risks of carbon monoxide poisoning globally, and I'll be writing to Cathy Foley, who I was very moved to meet, along with the member.
Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gaza's healthcare system has been devastated, and many civilians are in desperate need for treatment and specialist care which is not available in Gaza itself. Will the Minister ensure the government continues to raise with Israel the importance of allowing safe passage out of Gaza for those children in need of urgent medical treatment, and will it consider additional evacuation routes for critically unwell children?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that important question. We've been working closely with Egypt, which of course has sought to support many of those requiring medical assistance. We continue to look very carefully at this issue, including across government. But of course, Gazans really need that healthcare support in Gaza, and we have been supporting that as the UK government.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure the Treasury bench will know, soft power and diplomacy are most effective when they're backed up by hard power. So when will the government commit to spending 3% of GDP on defence to make sure we have a real voice at the international table? When we encourage European countries to increase their defence spending.
I've got to say to the honourable gentleman, why didn't you decide to do that? You've left this to this government to get back to 2.5%, which we last had as a Labour government. I say to the honourable gentleman, he should have done this. We're going to do it.
I look forward to seeing relations between the UK and Iraq blossom in the years to come under this Labour government. Could the Minister share with me the recent conversations he's had with Iraqi counterparts on reducing barriers to trade, such as diverging trade regimes?
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to meet the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Dr. Fuad Hussain, during the official visit of his Prime Minister, al-Sudani, to the UK from the 14th to the 16th of January. During that visit, our two Prime Ministers signed the landmark Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, a wide-ranging treaty on trade and strategic cooperation, announcing a trade package worth up to £12.3 billion.
Right, we're now changing over the end of questions.
Before we start, the Government's own ministerial code says the text of statements should be provided in advance to the opposition and to the Speaker. It does not provide for the text to be redacted. I am particularly concerned at the reports that some of the redacted information was provided to the media in advance. If correct, that is a very discourteous to this House. I take it very seriously. Or it could well be that it's been leaked, in which case I hope there will be an inquiry to what has happened here. I will therefore ask the Prime Minister to look into what has happened in this case and report back to me and to the House as soon as possible. Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by giving my word to this House that this was not given to the media? I will absolutely have an inquiry into this, but I would not be that discourteous. I spoke to you this morning, Mr. Speaker. I wouldn't be discourteous to you or to the Leader of the Opposition in that way, or to the House, and I give you that assurance from this dispatch box. And I apologise to the Leader of the Opposition, and I will make that inquiry. Mr. Speaker, 3 years since Russia launched its vile assault on Ukraine, I would like to address the international situation and the implication for Britain's national security. Mr. Speaker, in my first week as Prime Minister, I travelled to the NATO summit in Washington with a simple message: that NATO and our allies could trust this government would fulfil Britain and indeed the Labour Party's historic role to put our collective security first. I spoke of my great pride, Mr. Speaker, to lead the party that was a founding member of NATO, the inheritor of the legacy of Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, who not only stood behind Winston Churchill in wartime, but won the peace by establishing the great post-war order here and abroad. Mr. Speaker, it's a proud legacy, but in a world like ours, it's also a heavy one, because the historical load we must carry to fulfil our duty is not as light as it once was. We must bend our backs across this House, because these times demand a united Britain, and we must deploy all of our resources to achieve security. Mr. Speaker, as a young man, I vividly remember the Berlin Wall coming down. It felt as if we were casting off the shackles of history, a continent united by freedom and democracy. If you had told me then that in my lifetime we would see Russian tanks rolling into European cities again, I would not have believed you. Yet here we are, in a world where everything has changed. Because 3 years ago, that is exactly what happened. Britain can be proud of our response. British families opened their doors to fleeing Ukrainians. The yellow and light blue fluttering on town halls and churches the length and breadth of this country. And the party opposite, in government, was robust in our response. I supported that in opposition. I applaud them for it now. And we have built on that, bringing our support for Ukraine to a record level this year. Mr. Speaker, we should not pretend that any of this has been easy. Working people have already felt the cost of Russian actions through rising prices and bills. Nonetheless, one of the great lessons of our history is that instability in Europe will always wash up on our shores, and that tyrants like Putin only respond to strength. Russia is a menace in our waters, in our airspace, and on our streets. They've launched cyber attacks on our NHS. Only 7 years ago, a chemical weapons attack on the streets of Salisbury. We must stand by Ukraine, because if we do not achieve a lasting peace, then the economic instability, the threats to our security, they will only grow. And so, as the nature of that conflict changes, as it has in recent weeks, it brings our response into sharper focus. A new era that we must meet, as we have so often in the past, together and with strength. Mr. Speaker, the fundamentals of British strategy are unchanged. I know that the current moment is volatile, but there is still no good reason why they cannot endure. So let me spell out to the House exactly how we will renew them for these times. First, NATO is the bedrock of our security and will remain so. It has brought peace for 75 years. It is as important today as the day on which it was founded. Putin thought he would weaken NATO. He's achieved the exact opposite. And it remains the organisation that receives the vast bulk of our defence effort in every domain, and that must continue. Second, we must reject any false choice between our allies, between one side of the Atlantic or the other. That is against our history, country, and party, because it's against our fundamental national interest. The US is our most important bilateral alliance. It straddles everything from nuclear technology to NATO to Five Eyes, AUKUS, and beyond. It survived countless external challenges in the past. We fought wars together. We're the closest partners in trade, growth, and security. So this week, when I meet President Trump, I will be clear. I want this relationship to go from strength to strength. But, Mr. Speaker, strength in this world also depends on a new alliance with Europe. As I said in Paris last week, our commitment to European defence and security is unwavering. But now is the time to deepen it. So we will find new ways to work together on our collective interests and threats, protecting our borders, bringing our companies together, seeking out new opportunities for growth. Third, Mr. Speaker, we seek peace, not conflict. And we believe in the power of diplomacy to deliver that end. That, of course, is most pressing in Ukraine. Nobody in this House or this country wants the bloodshed to continue. Nobody. And, Mr. Speaker, I've seen the devastation in Ukraine firsthand. What you see in places like Bucha, that never leaves you. But for peace to endure in Ukraine and beyond, we need deterrence. I know that this House will endorse the principle of winning peace through strength. So we will continue to stand behind the people of Ukraine. We must ensure they negotiate their future, and we'll continue to put them in the strongest position for a lasting peace. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, we must change our national security posture, because a generational challenge requires a generational response. That will demand some extremely difficult and painful choices. And through those choices, as hard as they are, we must also seek unity, a whole society effort that will reach into the lives, the industries, and the homes of the British people. I started this statement by recalling the era of Attlee and Bevin. And of course, this year we will mark many anniversaries of that greatest generation. We must find courage in our history, courage in who we are as a nation, because courage is what our own era now demands of us. So starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we also face enemies that are sophisticated in cyber attacks, sabotage, even assassination. And so our intelligence and security services are an increasingly vital part of protecting both us and our allies. So on top of the funding of 2.5% that I've just announced, going forward we will recognise the incredible contribution of our intelligence and security services to the defence of the nation, which means taken together we will be spending 2.6% on our defence from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. The nature of warfare has changed significantly. That is clear from the battlefield in Ukraine. And so we must modernise and reform our capabilities as we invest. I equally want to be very clear that, like any other investment we make, we must seek value for money. And that's why we're putting in place a new defence reform and efficiency plan, jointly led by my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary. Yeah. This investment means that the UK will strengthen its position as a leader in NATO and in the collective defence of our continent. And we should welcome that role. It is good for our national security. It is also good for the defining mission of this government to restore growth to our economy. And we should be optimistic of what it can deliver in those terms. But, Mr. Speaker, in the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance, moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence. I want to be clear to the House. That is not an announcement I am happy to make. I'm proud of our pioneering record on overseas development, and we will continue to play a key humanitarian role in Sudan, in Ukraine and in Gaza, tackling climate change, supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination. In recent years, the development budget was redirected towards asylum backlogs, paying for hotels. So as we're clearing that backlog at a record pace, there are efficiencies that will reduce the need to cut spending on our overseas programmes. But nonetheless, it remains a cut, and I will not pretend otherwise. We will do everything we can to return to a world where that is not the case and rebuild a capability on development. But at times like this, the defence and security of the British people must always come first. That is the number one priority of this government. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not just about spending. Our whole approach to national security must now change. We will have to ask British industry, British universities, British businesses and the British people to play a bigger part. Use this to renew the social contract of our nation, the rights and responsibilities that we owe one another. The first test of our defence policy is, of course, whether it keeps our country safe. But the second should be whether it improves the conditions of the British people. Does it help provide the economic security that working people need? Because ultimately, as Attlee and Bevan knew, that is fundamental to national security as well. We will use this investment as an opportunity. We will translate defence spending into British growth, British jobs, British skills, British innovation. We will use the full powers of the Procurement Act to rebuild our industrial base. And, Mr. Speaker, as the Strategic Defence Review is well underway, and across government we're conducting a number of other reviews relevant to national security, it's obvious that these reviews must pull together. So before the NATO summit in June, we will publish a single national security strategy, and we will bring it to this House because, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, that is how we must meet the threats of our age, together and with strength. A new approach to defence, a revival of our industrial base, a deepening of our alliances, the instruments of our national power brought together, creating opportunity, assuring our allies, delivering security for our country. Mr. Speaker, at moments like these in our past, Britain has stood up to be counted. It has come together, and it has demonstrated strength. That is what the security of our country needs now, and it is what this government will deliver. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for the partial copy of his statement. And now that I've heard the unredacted bits, I must welcome his response and his fulsome support for Ukraine. This weekend marked a grim milestone. It's now 3 years since Putin's invasion, and the Conservative Party stands resolutely with the people of Ukraine. Our hearts are with those still caught up in this conflict, as we remember the many innocent lives lost. I will always be proud of the support the last Conservative government gave in the run-up to Putin's invasion and those first crucial weeks and months of the war. We helped prevent Kiev falling, and we supported Ukraine in regaining territory initially lost to Russia. But it is also true that overall, the West has not done enough to support Ukraine. As has been the case from the outset, it remains ultimately for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation that has sacrificed so much to defend itself and the fundamental freedoms that we all hold dear. It is up to them to decide their future. So we want this terrible war to end, but Ukraine needs to be at the negotiating table. And like President Zelensky, we hope for a lasting, reliable peace. But the West must continue to be intensely robust in the face of Putin's aggression. The lesson of the last 20 years is clear. He only comes back for more. The first duty of every government is to protect its people. That means a strong state that stands up for our national interest. Our foreign policy should seek to support our national interest. National interest should always come first. So I'm very pleased to hear the Prime Minister announce that increase to 2.5% by 2027. All of us on this side of the House welcome that. We've all wanted to see more spending on defence. I would ask the Prime Minister, on including the intelligence budget, can he confirm that this is new money for the intelligence services? And does this mean that there will be new money in the next financial year? The Prime Minister will know that I wrote to him at the weekend with suggestions on what we could do to help with increasing defence spending, so I welcome his announcement on repurposing money from the overseas development budget. That is absolutely right. And I look forward to him taking up my other suggestion of looking at what we can do on welfare. He will know that we had a fully funded plan, and we urge him to take it up. Having said that, can the Prime Minister say in confidence that 2.7%, the 2.5% by 2027 is sufficient? Because we need to look at exactly how we fund this. He must not raise taxes further, as it will destroy our economy. We need a strong economy to pay for strong defence. He cannot borrow more. We are already spending more on debt interest than defence. We all know that he must make difficult decisions on spending. He has our support to do that. In his statement, the Prime Minister also told us about his new value for money defence reform and efficiency plan. Does he agree that the first thing that must be looked at is spending billions of taxpayer money leasing back a defence base on Diego Garcia that we currently own? Why is the Prime Minister still pursuing this deal? Earlier today, I made a speech about the realism that should drive our foreign policy. As part of this, the Prime Minister must scrap his disastrous plan to surrender the Chagos Islands and have British taxpayers pay for the privilege. The key difference between those of us on this side of the House and the Labour Party is that we know we need a strong economy for defence. We need a serious plan to get the British economy growing again. We do not have that with the latest budget from the Chancellor. So can the Prime Minister tell us if there is going to be a fiscal event this spring, even though his government is committed to only one fiscal event a year? In summary, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made 4 points. I agree with him that NATO is a bedrock of our security, as I said this morning. And I agree that the US is our most important bilateral relationship, but friends tell each other when they disagree. We agree on this issue. We know that Ukraine must be supported, and I share the concerns the Prime Minister had about statements that had been made about President Zelensky. I agree with the Prime Minister on protecting security in Europe. I welcome his continuing to strengthen alliances. But we must do that through NATO, building on the Joint Expeditionary Force approach. And we, of course, agree that we need peace with Ukraine, agreed. I don't necessarily agree with his change in the national security posture because we have different views on this. I am a conservative realist, not a progressive internationalist. But I want him to know that when he does the right thing, we will work with internationalist. But I want him to know that when he does the right thing, we will work with him in the national interest.
Prime Minister.
Can I first thank her for her support in relation to today's announcement and her support on Ukraine. That is important to the government, it's important to the House, but mostly it's important to the Ukrainians and to President Zelensky because they want to see unity in our House. They value unity in our House as they enter, after 3 years of a conflict, a very difficult stage of the war with Russia and the Russian aggression. And I hope and I believe we can maintain that unity in relation to Ukraine. We have for 3 years, and I'm very proud that this House has done that, notwithstanding a change of government, for 3 long years. We will continue to do so. She asked about the money on defence and security and intelligence. There was new money at the budget in relation to that, but what I'm doing here is in addition to the 2.5%, which is the increase in defence spend as it's always been understood, is to recognise that the nature of the threats to our country are different now, and that the security and intelligence services play a key part for us and for our allies in our defence, and that takes the total to 2.6. She asked me if we're going to tax to pay for the 2.5% or to borrow to pay for the 2.5%. The answer to that is no, which is why I've set out precisely pound for pound how we will pay for it today. That has meant a very difficult decision on overseas development, a very difficult decision, and not a decision that I wanted to take or that I'm happy to take. But it is important that we explain where the money will come from in terms and explain where it's coming from today. And I was only ever going to come to the House with a plan, with a timeline in it, a percentage in it, and an answer to the question, how are you going to pay for it? I would not have come to the House with a fanciful plan. And she says they had a plan. She says, of course we did. I've views on it, but the Institute of Government said of their pledge for 2.5% by 2030, Institute for Government, it does not add up, it's not a serious plan. The Institute for Fiscal Studies called it misleading and opaque. I'm not giving my view, I'm giving the view of other bodies having looked at the plan that they put forward. They said they would fund it by cutting the civil service, and then they increased the civil service by 13,000. I'm not prepared to operate in that way, which is why we've taken the difficult decision on overseas development today to be absolutely clear where the money is coming from. In relation to the final point about the approach that we take here and whether there's a difference between us, I hope not. Because what I set out was NATO first as the bedrock of our security. I hope that that is common ground, whatever we may call our respective positions. I also set out that we must not choose between the US and our European allies. That is what I fundamentally believe, and I will resist that choice. I hope that that is common ground between us, notwithstanding the language that she uses, because that is important, not for the exchanges over this dispatch box, but the future defence and security of our country and of Europe. Thank you.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tamanji Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement on defence and security, because times are changing and we must all recognise that these are pivotal moments, not just for our nation's security, but also for our Ukrainian friends, whom we must wholeheartedly support in their fight for survival. Mr. Speaker, in my role as Defence Committee Chair, during my various interactions with key stakeholders, I've begun to realise that there is considerable consternation amongst our European allies about whether long-established and hard-earned alliances, rather than a short-term transactional approach, can still be relied upon to secure lasting peace. And also, given the proposed decreased American presence in our continent, people are looking for leadership, and I feel that this is our time as a nation to step forward and take that lead on defence and security matters in our continent. So does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree that he will convey to President Trump and our American allies about our allies' anxieties and the need to strengthen our transatlantic NATO alliance at this perilous time for Europe? And does he also agree that he can be that person to take the lead on defence and security matters in Europe while coalescing our NATO allies?
Can I just gently say, I know you've got a lot to say, but I've got a lot of members to get in. I've still got other bleeders. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I do agree that our alliances are important, and that's why NATO is the bedrock of our approach. It has been for many, many years and will continue to do so. I do accept that European allies and the UK have to step up and do more. In our heart of hearts, I think, across this House, we've known that this moment was coming for the last 3 years. And now we've put that plan before the House. And, of course, I will do everything I can to strengthen the alliance and the relationship between the US and the UK. It is a special relationship. It is a strong relationship. I want it to go from strength to strength. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Red Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for citing this statement? 3 years ago, Putin began his brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as we watched Russian missiles rain down on Ukrainian cities, we feared he might have struck a decisive blow to Ukraine and its sovereignty. Yet Putin underestimated the strength of the ideals we share with our Ukrainian friends of democracy, truth, and liberty. He underestimated the courage and grit of Ukrainian soldiers who have spent 3 years heroically resisting Putin's war machine. Britain stood together with our allies in support of Ukraine. Families up and down the country opened their doors wide for Ukrainian refugees, because we know that Ukraine's fight for democracy and liberty is our fight too. And in this House together, we stood strong together. And yet 3 years on, the future of Ukraine and security in Europe seems even more perilous. Then, Washington was clearly on our side, but now the United States is voting with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea in the United Nations. President Trump labels President Zelensky a dictator, but not Vladimir Putin. Mr. Speaker, after the Second World War, Britain came together with allies around the world to establish NATO, and with America agreed to underwrite security on this continent, recognizing the threat to the security of one nation was a threat to the security of all nations. Mr. Speaker, the events of the past few days are clear. That era is over. We may be watching before our very eyes the betrayal of our Ukrainian allies by America, and with it the potential betrayal of Europe and of Britain too. We must respond. Now it is up to the United Kingdom to lead in Europe. As a nation, we must seize this moment. Mr. Speaker, it is for our national interest that Liberal Democrats have supported the Prime Minister's proposals on Ukraine, including British troops joining a reassurance mission in Ukraine if a just settlement is reached. And that is why we strongly support the Prime Minister raising defence spending to 2.5%, preferably using seized Russian assets to pay for extra defence support for Ukraine. We will scrutinise all aspects of the government's spending plans carefully, but I hope that moving at pace to 2.5% will mean ministers will shortly announce the reversal of the Conservatives' short-sighted cut of 10,000 troops from our armed forces. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right. We must go further. So will the Prime Minister initiate talks between all parties in this House to establish that vital consensus needed to take us to spending 3% of GDP on defence as soon as possible? The Prime Minister will know that for months, we Liberal Democrats have urged the government to seize the frozen Russian assets, which amount to over £20 billion, and repurpose those funds for Ukraine's defence. So will he take immediate steps to gather European leaders and begin the seizure of Russian assets so that we can support Ukraine no matter what America does? And will he, on his trip to Washington, try to persuade President Trump to do the same, to make Russia pay? The Prime Minister will know that the whole country will be willing him on, hoping that he might be able to persuade Donald Trump to change his mind on Ukraine. We on these benches think he is right to try. But should that not work, Mr. Speaker? Will he be clear where the United Kingdom then stands? And will he make it clear that if necessary, if absolutely necessary, it will be with Ukraine and our European allies, not Putin and Trump?
Prime Minister.
Can I firstly thank him for his support on Ukraine? It's been steadfast and it's been across this House, and for the same reasons as I replied to the Leader of the Opposition, it is important, not just here but to those in Ukraine. We do need to step up and lead in Europe. We've been saying that for a very long time. All European countries need to do more, and now is the moment to do so. But we need to do that together with the US, because what is needed more than anything is a lasting peace, a ceasefire that simply gives Putin the chance to regroup and to go again is in nobody's interest. A lasting peace means that we must talk about issues like security guarantees. We are prepared to play our part, as I've already indicated, but I've also indicated that to be a security guarantee, it also requires a US backstop, US support for that security guarantee, and that will be at the heart of the case that I've been making for some time. On the question of assets, as he knows, of the assets that have been seized already, the interest on those, the £3 billion, has already been committed to Ukraine, and we are working with our European allies to see what more can be done in relation to the funding that's going to be necessary. Stepping up means stepping up on capability, coordination, and stepping up on funding, which is what we've done today with this statement.
Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Dame.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement today and this strong commitment to defence spending. And I welcome as well the work being done with the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary on ensuring that we get every value we can for the pound that's spent in delivering capability. Will the Prime Minister also reaffirm his commitment to the parliamentary scrutiny of that spending, including on the most sensitive areas?
Yes, of course, it's extremely important, and she knows that well. She's absolutely right to say we must get value for money. This is a huge increase in defence spending. It's very important it's used on the right capabilities in the right way, and that's why we intend to get a much better grip on the money that will be put in.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement?
I personally think it's a start, not a finish. I think we will find we will have to be raising defence spending further, but I welcome it nonetheless, and I, on behalf of all of this House as well, and my right honourable friend, will support that as he goes forward. He's due to go to Washington, and one of the problems we've got there is that they seem to reach the conclusion that peace is simply the absence of war. Can he make sure that he reminds the President that a peace without justice and the right to freedom and choice in democracy is not peace, but a partial ceasefire? And what I also say to him, he might just go and remind the President that the last great test that we faced united the United Kingdom and America, with Lady Thatcher and Ronald Reagan taking decisions that moved Europe in the right direction. Can he appeal to him, instead of running around making adverse comments, perhaps to link hands with the United Kingdom to persuade the rest of Europe to step up as we are now stepping up?
Prime Minister.
Can I firstly thank him for his support, and the point he makes about a lasting peace and what it must be is really important, because this isn't about just stopping the fighting. It is about an enduring and lasting peace for Europe, and of course the sovereignty of Ukraine, the sovereign ability to choose the alliances that Ukrainian people want, to choose their own government, to choose how they defend themselves in conjunction with others. That is the sovereignty that is in issue here. This isn't just about the sovereignty of Ukraine, but it is about the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is also about the values and freedoms across Europe, including our values and freedoms. And that is why this is such an important moment to ensure that NATO is as strong as we go forward as it's been in the last 75 years, and that bond between us and the US is as strong as it's ever been. And of course that has to be part of the case, the argument, and the way in which we have stepped up today and will continue to do so.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and particularly his commitment to accelerate the increase in defence spending, although I do fear that we may have to visit the 3% target before the next Parliament. But can I just ask him this question? It's very important that we have a whole society approach to defence, and I'm asking whether he'll be bringing forward a strategy to make that happen, and particularly around the great need to improve our reservist forces.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it does have to be a whole society response, and that's why I set that out. I'm grateful to him for raising it in my statement to the House. And of course it has to be a driver of industrial growth and our industrial strategy.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aside from a few of Putin's poodles who are not in their seats in this chamber here today, we are of course united in our support for the people of Ukraine, and indeed in wishing the Prime Minister well in his discussions with the President of the United States later this week. But I'm afraid that's where the unity ends, because whilst we support increasing defence spending, we cannot support the populist playbook of cutting foreign aid. Indeed, that's a position which was shared and agreed with by the Foreign Secretary just a matter of days ago, when he said that it would be a big strategic mistake that would allow China to step in. Why was the Foreign Secretary wrong and the Prime Minister right?
Prime Minister.
Well, let me thank him for his support on the question of Ukraine. That is important. And just to reassure him, the decision that I've taken today on development aid is not an ideological decision. I absolutely understand the importance of it. It's a very difficult and painful decision, but a necessary decision. He talks about choice. They welcomed the biggest settlement since devolution in the budget, but they voted against it because they couldn't take a choice. He welcomes the increase in defence spending, but he doesn't want to say how he will fund it. Choices, grown-up choices about the future of Europe require grown-up decisions and choices, and that is what we've done.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, instability in Europe does wash up on our shores, and so can I accept the hard decision the Prime Minister has made today to invest in defence, and this means difficult decisions in international development. My question is, though, can we please invest more in cyber, given the disinformation and the cyber attacks that our country faces on a daily basis?
Right, thank you for raising this, because cyber is part of the tools for warfare these days, which is why we increased funding at the budget and why I've adjusted the 2.5 to 2.6 in the way we presented the case to the House today.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree entirely with the strategic direction the Prime Minister has set out today. Defence and security must come first, but he does have choices about how he funds this important uplift. He and I voted together in the last Parliament against balancing the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. Does he still think that vote was right?
Well, I'm proud of that vote at the time. I'm proud of the work that our country has done on development, and this is not a decision that I want to make, and I absolutely want us to get back to more funding on overseas development and increasing those capabilities. Obviously, some of that is helped if we can, as we are, get the asylum backlog down and stop using this money to pay for hotels, which is not what it's intended for. But this has been a difficult decision. He knows how much I value overseas development, how important it is. But I thought and do think that the most important thing today is to be absolutely clear about the commitment we're making on defence, to spell out the reasons we're making those decisions, and to set out penny and pound exactly how it's going to be funded. What I wasn't going to do is come to this House with a plan that was not credible and not costed, because I think that would be far worse for our country. But the tenor of what he says I do accept in terms of the importance.
Alex Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and for the leadership he has shown on these issues in these uncertain times. As a member of Parliament for the home of the British Army, this is hugely welcome news for my constituency, and my community is ready to serve. Can I ask the Prime Minister what he is going to do to help create jobs in our defence sector in my community?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for her question, and her constituency and constituents are obviously hardwired into this in the makeup of her constituency. I do think that this is an obligation, an important obligation that we must rise to, but it is also an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the jobs that will be generated through this are British jobs with British skills in all of our constituencies, and we'll endeavour to make sure that that is the case.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we're pleased to hear the announcement that the government will increase their defence spending to 2.5%, but we're still waiting for the SDR review to be completed, and without this we're in the dark. So will the SDR review be announced soon, and if not, can the Prime Minister outline how this additional money will be spent?
The SDR is advanced, and I will come to the House with it just as soon as we can. I want to make sure that we have properly identified the challenges and the capabilities. Now we've put the funding forward, obviously, today, so we will do that as soon as we can, and when we do it, it'll be a credible plan for the House.
Zuba Hamid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his tireless efforts in trying to bring security to Ukraine, because their security is our security. But I wonder if you will agree with me that this is only possible because we are one united kingdom. That strength, that solidarity is only possible because of our four nations working together. And will they agree with me that those that attempt to fragment that union at these perilous times do us great harm?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with that. I think that as the United Kingdom, we have always stood up in moments like this, and we stand up again as the United Kingdom, and we're proud to do so. This is an important moment at a juncture after 3 years of a conflict. The whole House will be aware of the consequences of decisions in coming weeks, or the potential consequences. I think it's a time for us to pull together.
Sir Julian Lewis.
President Trump says he wants his legacy to be that of a peacemaker. So in his difficult conversations with the President, in a few days' time, will the Prime Minister remind him that the reason why the enforced division of Czechoslovakia before the war was a step on the road to disaster, whereas the division of Germany at the end of the war did not lead to World War III, was that the western half of Europe at the end of World War II was not demilitarized. So if there's to be a stable Ukraine after any such enforced division, there must be military protection for the unoccupied half of Ukraine.
Prime Minister.
He's right to talk about peace. It's what everybody wants, not least the Ukrainians. But it must be a lasting peace and not a temporary ceasefire. And I do agree that means it needs security guarantees. The configuration of that needs to be agreed, but it needs to be security guarantees sufficient to deter any further aggression, because otherwise it will be the ceasefire and will be the worst of outcomes for the whole of Europe.
Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his leadership and the announcement today, committing us to 2.6% of defence spend at GDP on defence spending and 3% beyond that. This is in stark contrast to the 14 years of erosion of defence spending and of the hollowing out of our services and the service life that resulted. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the reforms being put forward by the Defence Secretary are essential to deliver deterrence and prevent further acts of Russian brutal imperialist aggression in Europe?
Prime Minister.
The reforms are really important. The strategic review is very important, and the funding is very important, because this is a moment where we must step up and play our full part in the defence of our country and the defence of Europe. And I've already said what I said about the plan that the party opposite put forward at the election. I've not quoted my words, I've quoted the words of the Institute for Government, who said it was... well, I would say what I think, but I think what they said was perfectly right, which was it wasn't properly funded, it wasn't a credible plan. We've put a credible plan before the House, and I'm glad it's been welcomed.
Where should we go? Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Plaid Cymru stands firm with the need to safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty, because international security is also national security. But the UK will now cut the already diminished foreign aid budget to fund military spending. National security calls for building peace as well as armed forces. Given the importance that overseas aid plays in preventing conflict, building democracy and curbing warmongering tyrants, and to paraphrase his Foreign Secretary, surely this too is a massive strategic and moral mistake.
Prime Minister.
Well, she's right to raise the importance of overseas development. I've said that from the dispatch box a number of times. But this is a moment where we have to step up. This is a moment where we have to increase our defence spending. Of course, everybody in this House would wish that wasn't the situation. We've had a peace dividend for many years. That has come to an end, and we have to step up, and our first duty is to keep the country safe. And in order to do that, it requires a credible plan, a difficult plan, I accept, not a plan, not a decision I wanted to make, but a credible plan for the defence and security of our country and the defence and security of Europe.
Richard Quidley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and I agree with him that it is the beginning, not the end of the process. But does he agree it's not just how much money you spend, but how well you spend it? And will he join me in thanking all of our armed forces personnel for the commitment they show day in, day out to defending our nation?
Prime Minister.
I agree with both those propositions in terms of what we spend, how we spend it, and of course, speaking for myself, for the government, I'm sure for the whole House, we thank our armed services for what they do on our behalf day in, day out.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is without doubt that an enduring peace is only achieved if we have enduring security arrangements. So I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's announcement on defence expenditure and the commitment to it. But I would like to reiterate my observation, the observation of others, around the way that that money is spent. For a generation, we have been complacent, and there is significant dysfunctionality
in the way that industry works with government on the procurement and delivery of defence capabilities in this country. I would urge him to keep his Defence Secretary in place for the duration of this Parliament, so he can so that we can, across this House, find some common purpose to deliver enduring reforms that stand the test of time. Treasury after Treasury has found it impossible to get to grips with defence expenditure. We must achieve that in this Parliament.
Prime Minister.
Well, the Defence Secretary just asked me if he could reply to that question. But the point he makes is a really important one. Procurement has not been in the right place. The grip on defence spend hasn't been in the right place, and we haven't used our businesses in the way that I think we could have done in the past. I mean, I would gently say 14 years. It might have been a good period to have got to grips with that. But we do need to get to grips with it now. I actually think it'll be welcomed by the whole House as we do so, because we do need to do that.
Louise Jones.
Of my colleagues started my career in the shadow of Putin's first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014. We knew then what Putin was capable of, and we knew then what Putin intended to do. However, our service was marked by swinging cuts from the Conservative government that left our armed forces lacking key capabilities. There's an old saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. Can the Prime Minister assure me that this extra cash will be well spent to cover those capabilities and take advantage of the new technologies we desperately need?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank her for her question, but also for her service? And she's absolutely right that this money must be well spent on the capability that we need, and it will.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the statement from the Prime Minister today, and also wish him well as he goes to America to persuade the Americans to side with democracy rather than vote with dictators. The announcement today, of course, will have a long lead-in period before we actually see the effects. And given that and the overstretched commitments of our armed forces, how can he give assurances to the Ukrainians that Britain will be able to supply arms and personnel to defend any peace agreement which is reached?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his support. On the question of security guarantees, obviously quite intense discussions are going on at how that would look, what it might involve. I'm absolutely confident that we can play our full part. I won't disclose details to the House for reasons that he will understand, but I'm confident that we can and we will play our full part in whatever security guarantees may be needed. Of course, with US backing, which is important, if there to be proper guarantees.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the uplift in defence spending, but as the Prime Minister has recognised, this is a difficult decision when it comes to our aid budget. I, like many others in the House, have seen the first-hand impact that the aid budget makes, not only on tackling poverty, but on our own stability and prosperity. So I welcome what the Prime Minister has said so far, but can he reassure us that our commitment to get back to 0.7% as soon as fiscal circumstances allow still remains?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I want to see that. And I also want to reassure the House that on vital issues like Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine, notwithstanding the difficult decision that we've taken today, it is important that they are prioritised for reasons that are obvious across the House.
Other chance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, there are members across the House clearly recognise the need to invest more and indeed to invest differently in defence and security. It's obviously, unbelievably counterproductive and short-sighted to fund that by slashing aid to the poorest and most fragile countries, or indeed by squeezing already stretched departmental budgets. So can I ask the Prime Minister, why will he not fund this by increasing taxes on the most wealthy rather than placing the burden on the poorest?
Prime Minister.
I don't think that the plans, as far as I've seen them being put forward on the other side, are realistic. It is for us, if we're to make a commitment like this, to put forward a credible, costed plan where we can say with certainty precisely where the money is coming from. And that's why we've taken the difficult decision that we've taken today.
Dr. Reparations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's statement hits the nail on the head. Unlike the rantings of J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference on European freedom of speech. So I know that it's going to be particularly welcome in the Ealing Ex-Servicemen's Club. Could I ask him, therefore, to recommit to our veterans, to the OSCE, and to organisations like the Army Cadet Centre in Acton and the TA Reservists in Wood Lane, either of which would welcome a visit, for those who have served our nation and who will do in the future?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I'm happy to make that commitment, and I'd ask her to carry that message to her constituents, along with the thanks of myself, the Government, and the House.
Mr.
Speaker, when the Prime Minister flies off to Washington, will he go taking the confidence that this House and indeed the whole country are behind him and wish him well in that very difficult meeting, knowing that this country and our continent is possibly facing the most dangerous moments that we have seen since the height of the Cold War? Will he also, may I also welcome the statement increasing defence spending, some of us would say a couple of decades overdue, but will he accept that the benchmark for the success of the defence review is not some arbitrary percentage of what we're spending. It's whether we are spending whatever is necessary to give back to our armed forces the war-fighting capability that is the only real deterrence that the Russians will respect. And can I say to him, I very much doubt that 2.5% or 3% will be enough, and I don't say that as a criticism, but as something, as a nation, that we must be prepared for.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for his sentiment, and I think it is important at a moment like this that I'm able to carry the House with me as we undertake the next stage of these discussions about the security and defence of Europe, because it is a very important generational moment, and this House and this country have always come together and stood up at moments like this. Look, I know he's been a long supporter of increased defence spending and capability, and the notion that there must be a war-fighting capability. He's right about that, and that's why we made the decision we have today.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and his strong leadership. Does the Prime Minister agree that as we rightly reassert the concept of taking responsibility by our own people, military and economy, but also by our friends on the continent of Europe, we must also reassert the responsibility of all countries to defend the international rules-based system that has at its core the concept that bullies must not get away with invading their neighbours. Because if they do, not only will we dishonour the bravery and sacrifice of our Ukrainian friends, but also our collective security will be weakened.
Prime Minister.
Well, two of those rules-based systems are fundamental: the UN Charter and the NATO framework, and all of the articles in it. Hugely important rules-based frameworks that we must absolutely adhere to. And I wrote many times about the UN Security Council as a lawyer. My first appearance at the Security Council was sitting around a table with a country that was in clear violation of the Charter itself, and I did not feel at all comfortable.
Victoria Collins.
3 years ago, I have distinct memories of helping my Ukrainian friends and colleagues flee the country as tanks came towards their homes. Since then, people across Harpenden and Berkhamsted have opened their doors, but the hope that they once had has turned to fear, and fear of what is happening globally. So can the Prime Minister please assure the British people that when he speaks to President Trump, he will push for that lasting peace, but highlight the importance of working with our European colleagues?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I through her, thank again everybody in this country who's opened their doors to Ukrainian refugees. I'm very proud of the fact that we have done that and that the flag flies in so many places across the country. I can reassure her constituents this announcement today, the approach that we're taking, is to ensure that peace continues. But for peace to continue, we have to put ourselves and put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, and this is a step along that road.
Alistair Strathern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It's shameful that in such a volatile world, for far too long, conversations around defence spending have had a lot of hot air, but not much hard action. Today, I think colleagues across the House will have to recognise the Prime Minister has changed that, with a clear, funded and needed plan to invest in our defence. But when supply chains are so important to security, he'll recognise, as I do, that it's not just what we spend, but where we spend it that's going to matter too. So how will he make sure our whole government is united in the effort to build up our domestic supply chain capacity when it comes to key defence assets again?
Prime Minister.
Well, this is where the industrial strategy and growth is so important, because as we move to higher defence spend, it is vital that we ensure that supply chains are in this country as far as they can be, and that they lead to British well-paid, secure jobs. We know that the defence sector already provides many well-paid jobs across the country. I want more.
Can I say to those who are late, please don't embarrass the chair by standing. Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And almost on that point, what an abdication of responsibility and duty that on these precious issues of defence and security, there's not a single member of the Reform Party who's capable or able to stand and ask a question of the Prime Minister this afternoon. Very different seriousness on the issues on this side of the House and on the government benches. Many have asked the Prime Minister about the use of the frozen assets of Russians. Anybody who studied the issue with regards to Libya will just know how complicated international law and convention has made the defrosting of frozen assets to deploy for proper use. Can the Prime Minister, in his discussions in Washington and with the other European leaders, press for urgent, collaborative international reform to those rules to allow those frozen assets to be used to be helping the Ukrainians and their military to defeat Russian aggression?
Prime Minister.
The point he raises is a really important one. It is very complicated for reasons that he will understand. Obviously, we've been able to use some of the interest on those frozen assets, which has provided valuable to Ukraine. But look, we do need to work with our European colleagues and collaborate on other legitimate, proper and ways to raise further funding, and we'll continue to do that with our allies.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I really welcome the statement from the Prime Minister. This is a major commitment to our defence. I think it will be heard across the world and welcomed by our allies, particularly those facing Russian or Iranian aggression. Can the Prime Minister please set out how he will ensure British businesses, who are so crucial to our defence, are supported in this important task?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That has to be through the industrial strategy and through the growth strategy that we will put in place, but it is vital that this is seen not just as a duty and responsibility, which is what it is, but also an opportunity in relation to British businesses, British jobs, well-paid, secure jobs that are so vital to so many communities.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that he can rely on the support of the SNP with regard to efforts to restore Ukrainian sovereignty in the face of Russian aggression, despite the baseless rhetoric from the benches behind him. And I'd like him to acknowledge that. And I welcome that he's raised defence expenditure to 2.5%, albeit by 2027, which will be 3 years after the election, despite it being in the Labour Party's manifesto. But it cannot be right to balance those books with a government budget of 1.1 trillion of the poorest in the global society. So when he goes to Washington on Thursday and he gets his pat on the back from the United States President, will he spare a thought for the predominantly women and children who will suffer immeasurably, and some of whom will die as a result of his decision today?
Well, can I thank him for his support on Ukraine, support that I know the First Minister has set out in clear terms in recent days, and I do think that's important, and I acknowledge it. We've had to make difficult decisions, but as he knows, as the House knows, wherever there's war and conflict, it is the poor and the poorest who are hit hardest. There is no easy way through this, but we have to ensure that we win peace through strength, because anything other than peace will hit the very people he's identified harder than anybody else on the planet. And that is why it's so important that we've taken the decision that we have today.
Rachel Taylor. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. National security is the first duty of any government, so I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement and his strong leadership today. The Honourable Member for Clacton has previously said that Vladimir Putin is the leader he admires the most, and that it was NATO that provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While this government rises to the challenge of investing in our defence, does the Prime Minister share my concern that those comments play right into the hands of Britain's enemies?
You don't show patriotism by fawning over Putin. Thank you.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. No decent government cuts international development budgets lightly, and the Prime Minister's discomfort is plain for all to see and will be shared across the House. But will he look at other things that perhaps present easier choices, and in particular his choice to spend billions of pounds on Mauritius, and will he repurpose that money in defence of our armed forces?
Prime Minister.
Obviously, in the short term, we've got to make decisions between the here and now and the commitment to 2.5% in 2027. And having looked at the available options, this was the choice that had to be made, and I think would have been made by any serious Prime Minister making the commitment that I've made today. Of course, I do think we need to look at other things as we go forward from here. Many people across the House have said that, and I've set out the ambition we need to get to on 3%, but I will only put forward credible, costed plans to this House, not fantasy figures. They chunter away. This is a moment for a serious costed plan. It's not a time for ridiculous, uncosted polling.
Jubin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. I think this entire House agrees that our safety, that of our allies, depends on showing Putin we have the resolve and the resources to defeat him. We are far more prosperous than he is. European NATO's GDP is 24.5 trillion. Russia's is only 2 trillion. But clearly what is before us is converting those resources into fighting forces and material in the years ahead. So can the Prime Minister assure me that strategic defence review and our defence industrial strategy will ensure we have long-term orders for the capacity that we need, as well as that, on top of that, secure supply chains, inputs like steel, and of course the ability to scale rapidly if we need to rearm so?
Well, thank you for raising those points. They're all important, and of course that has to be hardwired into the work we do as we go forward from today.
Dr. Lieutenant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the Prime Minister will have the support of both sides of this House when he goes to see President Trump on Thursday. I'd like to ask him, though, if he fails to encourage the US to become the backstop for the Ukraine, no matter how much he increases the spending in the next couple of years, there's going to be a difficulty there. So what conversations is he having as a backstop for Europe to make sure Ukraine gets that support?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not going to preempt the discussions I'll have, but the point he makes is an important one. I absolutely believe that we should play our full part in any security guarantees, if that is what happens. We don't even know whether we'll get to that stage. But I also absolutely think there needs to be a US backing of that, because I don't think it'll be operative as a security guarantee if there isn't that backing.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's statement today, because although difficult decisions have had to be taken today, the alternative is inaction, which is, of course, also a decision. Does the Prime Minister agree with me, though, that the lesson of history is that Ukraine's survival, Ukraine's defence, is completely indivisible from our own?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do, and that's why I say this isn't just about the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is about European defence and security and our own defence and security. And we've already paid a heavy price in this country when it comes to the contribution that we've made, the effect it's had on our cost of living, on our energy prices and so much else. But this is fundamental. It's about our values, it's about our freedom, and it's about understanding who Putin is and what his ambitions are. And we must never forget that.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With some of our European allies likening our predicament in 2025 to that of 1938. I'm concerned that the increase in defence spending announced today by the Prime Minister, whilst welcome, is going to be coming too late. Will the Prime Minister look at Liberal Democrat proposals to increase the digital services tax, which would this year raise £3 billion?
Prime Minister.
I don't accept the argument's come too late. It's come at a point where we're able to put the plan before the House, a credible costed plan. We've known, I think, for 3 years that this moment was going to come. I think the last few weeks have accelerated that, made it the more urgent, which is why I've made the statement I have today.
Jonathan Rash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's leadership today in undertaking the first duty of any leader, which is the defence of this nation, and reiterating that fundamental British value that our country opposes fascists. We never appease them. The Prime Minister talked rightly about renewing the social contract with the British people in terms of jobs, in terms of skills, in terms of industry. Does he agree with me that if we are to do that, it must reach every part of our country, including areas that I represent that are far too often left behind?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do. I think we must rise to that challenge. I think if you look at the defence sector, many of the well-paid, skilled jobs that already exist are across the whole of the United Kingdom. We need to ensure that there's more of those well-paid, skilled jobs across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today and also his acknowledgements that, as important as what he said here, he recognises that he and the government will come back with a view to getting towards 3%. He said in response to an earlier question that the peace dividend is gone. In light of that, does you agree with me that we need to also look at welfare spending, given that in current circumstances, no serious country can spend more on welfare than defence?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with that. I think the last government let it spiral by an additional £30 billion. It's out of control. We need to bring it back in control. I think 2.8 million people are out of work because they can't go to work because of some health-related issue. That's a very, very high number. It's out of control. We have to get it back in control.
John Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, with which I agree. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin showed that the defence of the United Kingdom and Europe against totalitarianism is at the core of this House's and our party's values, but also that what we can learn from their great political lives is that we will face very many difficult public spending decisions over the next decade, and our moral duty as a government is to take those decisions, however difficult or heartbreaking they may be.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that. I agree with him. These are difficult decisions, with very real consequences, which I acknowledge. But as an earlier contributor said, the alternative to action is inaction. And inaction, in the light of the last 3 years, and particularly the last few weeks, would be the completely wrong thing for our country and for our continent.
Jim Allister.
I absolutely agree with the Prime Minister that this is an important moment for our nation. I welcome the rebalance of expenditure towards defence, but does the Prime Minister agree that the success of our national security posture will not be judged by percentages? It will be judged by the strength of the deterrent that we build. And is it the abiding commitment of the Prime Minister to be unwavering in building such a deterrent?
Yes, it is, because I agree with him that it's the strength of our deterrent that counts in a moment like this. I'm very proud of our armed forces, of those that have provided so much for so long, but now is a time to ask more of them and to step up.
Gordon McKee.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke about the threat that Russia poses in our waters. Just a few weeks ago, I saw a piece of undersea cable which was cut, almost certainly by a Russian vessel. So, can I ask the Prime Minister, what more can the government do to protect Britain's undersea infrastructure from foreign attack?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising that issue. It's a bit like cyber. The way in which conflict and war and aggression is demonstrated these days is changing, and we must protect our vital assets, and that includes the cables under the sea. And I've had extensive conversations with European allies and with NATO about how we better protect that infrastructure.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have been to war 3 times, and each time working for an American general. General Schwarzkopf in the First Gulf War, the outstanding David Petraeus in the Second Gulf War, and for General Robert Mills of the US Marine Corps in Afghanistan. One of the lessons that keeps coming up after those wars is that we have to prepare for the fight that we don't want to have. Yeah. Can I welcome, absolutely, the Prime Minister's statement today, and also encourage him, as well as sending in the Chancellor into the new Defence Reform and Efficiency team, encourage him to take a personal interest in the way in which this money is spent in order that we prepare for the fight that we don't want to have.
Prime Minister.
Can I start by thanking him for his service, for his country? He's absolutely right that we have to prepare for the fight that we don't want to have. And I can assure him I have a very keen personal interest and duty and responsibility as Prime Minister on all of these matters.
Sean Davies.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I welcome the statement from my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. In places like Telford, which has a proud defence sector, those companies and the communities and the supply chain need certainty. So British taxpayers will be demanding that their money is used to support British-based companies to support our British troops around the world. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, assure me that each and every pound will be diverted to British industry or British-based industries to support our interests around the world?
Minister.
Well, I certainly want that to be the case wherever we can, and that's why we'll have the plan for reform and efficiency. But this needs to be translated into British skills, British jobs, secure jobs in every constituency across the land.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's disappointing that the Prime Minister's statement didn't include any reference to the United Nations or a pathway to end the dreadful conflicts in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan or Democratic Republic of Congo. Clearly, his statement will have a massive effect on the poorest people in the poorest countries in the world through a cut in overseas aid budgets. But what effect will it have on the poorest people in this country, for example, over the 2-child benefit cap, for example, the housing crisis that so many face? He says there's tough decisions coming up. What's going to be the effect on the poorest people in this country of the increase in defence spending?
Prime Minister.
Well, it says I didn't mention the UN. The UN Charter is at the heart of this, because Russia's in breach of it. Russia is an aggressor that has invaded another country and is occupying part of that country and will go further if they are encouraged down that line. And that is why we need to take these decisions. It is the first duty of government to keep our country safe and secure. It's a duty I take extremely importantly. And the poorest people in this country would be the first to suffer if the security and safety of our country was put in peril.
Mark Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is absolutely right to say that NATO is the bedrock on which we found our alliance. He's absolutely right to say that we can only achieve peace through strength. And he is absolutely right to cut the foreign development budget to pay for a £13.4 billion increase in defence spending. It's a difficult decision, but there is nothing more important than the defence and the security of the British people. Can I ask the Prime Minister what conversations he's had or hopes to have with our European allies about their defence spending and whether he hopes to see increases across the continent in the future?
Prime Minister.
I've had, as you may know, extensive discussions with all of our European allies, particularly intense over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and will continue to do so because we are right to say that Europe and the United Kingdom need to step up. We need to do that alongside our allies. That means capability, coordination and spending. And the best way, in my view, to do that is in a collegiate, collaborative way, working with our allies, and that's what I've been doing.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In a world where our adversaries are intent on blunting our national security and prosperity, I welcome the Prime Minister's statements and thank him for his commitment to increasing defence spending. Can the Prime Minister update the House on what actions the government is taking to discourage BRICS nations and other emergent high-growth economies from advertently or inadvertently doing anything that would assist Russia in its pursuit of its invasion in Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
I think this is a really important issue. And it is important that, as well as sanctions, we bear down on those that are providing assistance to Russia, whether that's countries or whether it's individual businesses, and we shall continue to do so, working with allies.
Kevin Bolivar.
Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is absolutely right to say this is a generational moment in this country's security. I pay tribute to this generation's armed forces and also all those who work in the defence sector, like in Stevenage, where they are refitting the Storm Shadows for use by Ukraine for their security and our security. Does my right honourable friend agree that an increase in defence spending that he has announced today, done properly, will also help the wider economy too?
Well, can I thank his constituents for working in Stevenage? It's such important work that is being done. And of course, it's important that we make sure that this is measured in jobs and secure jobs across the country.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last night I attended a concert in Bath Abbey, Stand Together, and the Ukrainian Deputy Ambassador was there, and he particularly praised the direct link that my Bath Council had formed with the city of Alexandria, as it forms such strong people-to-people contact and is enduring and provides direct support. What more can the government do to encourage other councils to form these direct links to Ukrainian communities? Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear about that direct link. I think the people-to-people contact is really important, both in relation to our appreciation and understanding of what's going on in Ukraine, and of course to the resilience of the Ukrainians, and I would support any such initiatives.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and in particular, I know the Ukrainian forces on the front lines will be reassured today. Clearly, the aid spending decision will not have been taken lightly. But following reductions at US aid, it does mean tens of billions out of the global aid system, which could be exploited by Russia and China. So I wonder, will the Prime Minister consider a deadline for ending the accounting of asylum costs to the aid budget, which is currently 28% or £4.2 billion of money that should be used on aid spending overseas?
Well, I thank him for raising this. It is a really difficult decision, and it is important that we make clear that we remain committed to the work we're doing in Gaza, in Ukraine and Sudan. And it is important, as he rightly says, that we get the asylum numbers down, the processing done, so that we can end the ridiculous use of money that should be for overseas aid on hotel bills in this country, which spiralled under the last government.
Ben Opsitetti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a veteran, I welcome the move to 2.5%. It's a milestone on the right track to increasing defence spending to 3.0 and probably beyond, particularly given defence chiefs are reported to have requested 2.65%. Increasing defence spending and suggesting that British forces may be involved in a peacekeeping mission along with ongoing support to Ukraine is reassuring to see that we are not prepared to acquiesce to Russian belligerence. With that in mind, as the Prime Minister prepares to meet with President Trump, will he clarify with the President why the US sided with Russia and North Korea yesterday, voting against the European resolution that Russia should withdraw from Ukraine at the UN General Assembly?
Well, can I thank him for his service as well? Our position on the UN resolution was clear from the way we voted yesterday. I think that sends a very powerful signal of where we stand, and that's with Ukraine.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement today and his commitment to 2.5% of defence spending, and also his continued engagement with our international partners. As a proud maritime nation and one that is facing threats from Russian interference with undersea cables and also incursion into our waters by the Shadow Fleet, does he agree that now is the time that we bolster our Royal Navy?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do think it's important that we bolster across our forces. There are threats on land, there are threats in the air, and there are threats at sea, and indeed under the sea. It's important that we can meet all of those threats.
Callum Miller.
Deputy Speaker. I welcome this important statement from the Prime Minister. Liberal Democrats support an increase in defence budget and the leadership in Europe that the Prime Minister has described. The Prime Minister spoke about the need for unity and a whole-society approach. He will have heard the concerns from across the House about the way in which he is proposing to fund this increase in the defence budget, and the deep concern that doing that will create opportunities for our adversaries Russia and China around the world. So will he undertake to meet with other parties in order to build the consensus behind the funding of 2.5 and then on to 3%, so that we can maintain the unity and the national purpose that he has so eloquently described?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for his support and the support of his party? I do think it's important at a moment like this. So far as the funding of the 2.5 is concerned, that has been set out today. The commitment of the ambition to get to 3% is something that I think we need to talk about across this House. Of course, I will work with all parties on any issue of security and defence to our country.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has delivered a very powerful statement today, and I know that his unwavering commitment to the defence of the realm will be greatly appreciated by my constituents in Stockton North. He mentioned industrial strategy. I wonder, does he agree with me that we need to start immediately to mobilise our steel, chemicals and shipbuilding industries, and working with regional groups like the Teesside Defence and Innovation Cluster to ensure that we build the capability that we need for our defence supply chains at home?
Prime Minister.
The industrial strategy and steel within it is vitally important, as he will know, the House will know. Steel and our ability to manufacture steel is vital to our security, and we must do everything to ensure that it is preserved into the future.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Scotland wants to play its full part in this great national endeavour at this moment of peril, yet almost incredibly tomorrow the Scottish Parliament will discuss stripping defence companies of state funding. It's quite remarkable. It may not pass, of course, I certainly hope it won't, but so will the industrial defence strategy take into account what's happening in Scotland, where certain elements do seem to be siding with other national interests to protect our defence industry and this great country?
Prime Minister.
I think across the country it's important that we stand by our defence sector, enhance our defence sector, thank them for the work that they are doing, and obviously today's announcement will mean that there's more yet to do.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, this government's unwavering support for Ukraine and this very necessary decision to increase defence spending. As someone whose close family is served in our armed forces, I know over the years as a country we've not always provided our servicemen and women with the equipment and the support that they deserve. Could the Prime Minister reassure the House that this funding will be used to ensure that our servicemen and women are provided with that equipment, that support and the respect, given that they are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for our country?
Prime Minister.
Yes, and it's hugely important, and we will ensure that we do so. I did have a family member who served, and his ship went down, and I will never forget the agony that my mother went through until she knew for sure that he was safe, and that is what's on the line each and every day for our armed services.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his very strong statement here today. In response to questions, he has talked about a national security position, a whole society response, and a time that we all pull together. Can I ask the Prime Minister to ensure that Northern Ireland businesses get to be part of that national response, but also that the government recognises and supports the strategic and long-term importance of Aldergrove in Northern Ireland as a military base and an RAF station, which can actually contribute to our national defence, but also to our international defence. And can I ask the Prime Minister, will he ask the Secretary of Defence to meet with me on those two issues?
Prime Minister.
He's right to raise the question of Northern Ireland, and it's very important that this is a whole United Kingdom effort, contribution, and that we ensure that those opportunities are there across the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland. I will, of course, ask the Defence Secretary, and I'm sure he will agree to the meeting that's requested.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I spent all of last week in Ukraine and had the opportunity to meet with one Defence Minister, with a number of soldiers on the front line. The Defence Minister painted a bleak picture of the situation there, including the fact that Russian productions of arms continue to go up and up and up. Meanwhile, the soldiers I spoke to on the front line are facing unimaginable challenges and need much more resources to win this fight. For that reason, I strongly welcome this announcement to get to 2.5% and increase support for Ukraine, and in future to get to 3%, because I'm convinced that we face an existential crisis in the world. However, of course, as someone who founded the Labour Campaign for International Development, I am pained by the news today, and I hope that we can get back on track to get to 0.7% as soon as possible. And in that spirit, I would just like to draw the Prime Minister's attention to the last government's record of thinking of innovative and different ways of getting development finance, and would ask the Prime Minister if he would meet with me and other MPs with development experience on these benches to look at alternative ways of financing support for development, such as special drawing rights from the IMF, such as more debt relief. I'd be grateful if the Prime Minister would do that.
Well, I thank him for his commitment to international development, and he's absolutely right about it. And of course, we will work across the House on alternative and innovative ways to support development across the world.
Greg Strafford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome wholeheartedly the announcements that the Prime Minister has made today, and I encourage him to get to 3% as soon as possible. But we don't just need to have a monetary value, we need to know how and where that money is going to be spent. This would be done through the Strategic Defence Review. This gives assurance to our allies, deterrence to our enemies, and of course, most importantly, confidence in our troops. So can he confirm whether the SDR will be published in spring, i.e. in a couple of weeks' time, or will be delayed, as it seems to suggest in the statement, until June?
Prime Minister.
I didn't mean to imply that in the statement. That was the security strategy. The STR is well underway, and as soon as it's completed, then I'll put it before the House. But the most important thing is we get it right, and that we ensure it is right, rather than meeting a timeline. I'm not seeking to delay it, but I am absolutely clear in my own mind that we need to make sure we understand the challenges we face, the capability, and I'm particularly struck by the developments in the 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine. The way the fighting started 3 years ago is very different to the way it is now. I was over there a few weeks ago, and amongst the things I took away was that we need to learn the lessons of Ukraine and bind them into what we are doing, rather than think that we're dealing with a world of even 2 or 3 years ago. And that's just why I want to make sure it's the right review, the right strategy to put before the House.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I should like to draw the House's attention to my declarations in respect of the GMB Defence Manufacturing Trade Union, when I welcome the commitment the Prime Minister set out to rebuilding the UK industrial capacity in defence. All governments face a balance between international collaboration and avoiding dependency on complex supply chains which can limit freedom of action, as some of our allies have found in their attempts to aid Ukraine. So does the Prime Minister agree that one of the objectives of the spending announced today must be to maintain and strengthen our sovereign freedom to aid our allies and defend our own shores?
I do agree with that, and I agree with his comments on the supply chains, which are vital to that security effort.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the former US Defence Secretary Jim Mattis said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately. Can the Prime Minister not see that funding this uplift through ODA is short-sighted and a strategic and moral mistake? Because prevention is cheaper than wars, because it gives more leverage for Russia and China, and because we do it on the backs of the world's poorest. In fact, it is something that I never thought I would see a Labour government doing, and a pitiful inheritance from 1997. And so given that this is a policy choice and not a retrospective fiscal one, it is in direct contravention of the law passed here in 2015, which rules out the link between levels of defence and development funding. And so will this Labour government be repealing it?
Minister.
She's right that prevention is better than war. That's why it's important that we prepare our defence to be able to secure and maintain the peace. That is precisely why I've made my statement today. She's wrong about the law, and we're not going to repeal it.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Always a surprise not to be called last, you know, but thank you very much. Can I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement. His statement today has encouraged everybody in this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and we thank him for that. That defence spending should rise from 2.5% to 3%. I just gently remind the House, of course, that in the Cold War, defence spending was 7%, so we've got a bit to go yet to catch up, but there we are. Whilst the new defence and security agreement with Norway, as an example, is to be welcomed, I'm a great believer in ensuring that whilst we build new rooms in a house for new family members, we ensure that existing family members are comfortable at home with us. So what discussion has the Prime Minister had with our closest allies, the United States of America, in terms of aligning our defence strategies, number one, and solidifying that network of information share? Thank you so much.
Minister.
Can I thank him for his support? He mentions Norway, and it is important that we already work with Norway very closely on defence and security. We want to enhance and strengthen that, and the bilateral relationship is going to strengthen. And of course, we need to work with the US. I'll be leaving for the US tomorrow. I've had a number of conversations with President Trump already, and our teams are speaking continually on these really important matters.
And the final question goes to the ever-patient Charlotte Kane.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome much of what was in the Prime Minister's statement, particularly our continued support for the brave people of Ukraine. However, I was shocked by what he describes as a difficult and painful decision to cut overseas aid. I suggest nowhere near as difficult and painful as it's going to be for the very poorest families who find that our aid is no longer there for them. It's also hugely short-sighted because helping communities be stable and secure reduces the risk of war and unrest. So will the Prime Minister please assure us that he is going to look for less damaging ways to fund this much-needed increase in defence expenditure?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, look, it is a difficult decision. There's no getting away from that. But we can't have a situation where members of this House stand up and support 2.5% heading to 3% on the one hand, and then can't agree or won't take the difficult decisions that are necessary in order to get there. I'm not pretending this is an easy decision. I'm certainly not pretending it's a decision I wanted to make as Prime Minister. It is a decision that I'm driven to make because of the security and safety of our country and our continent.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister. We've got in all members that were bobbing throughout. I'll give the front bench a few moments to swap over for the next statement. Now, if the Minister is ready, we'll move on to our second statement on the Warm Home Discount. Minister.
With your permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the action we are taking to protect families in the face of global spike in gas prices. In recent months, wholesale gas prices have risen to their highest level in 2 years. They are up nearly 15% compared to the previous price cap period. As a result, this morning Ofgem announced the energy price cap will rise by around £9 a month between April and June. We know that this will be unwelcome news for families across the country that are already worried about their bills. But as Ofgem CEO Jonathan Brearley said today, our reliance on international gas markets leads to volatile wholesale prices and continues to drive up bills. This week marks 3 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and once again the British people are paying the price of our country being exposed to fossil fuel markets controlled by petrostates and dictators. The truth is, every day we remain stuck on gas is another day families, businesses, and indeed the public finances are at risk from these kinds of price spikes. That is why sprinting to homegrown clean energy is the only way to end our exposure and our vulnerability as a country. In the meantime, we are determined to do all that we can to protect people, and today I want to set out the measures we are taking. First, we want to provide greater help to the most vulnerable in time for next winter. The Warm Homes discount currently gives around 3 million families a £150 rebate on their energy bills. The current system provides help to those on means-tested benefit, but excludes millions of people in homes not classified as hard to heat, as a result of criteria introduced by the last government in 2022. This criteria is seen by many as arbitrary and unreliable. It means there are families in almost exact same circumstances, with some receiving help and others not. Today, we have announced we will consult on proposals to abolish this restriction, meaning all households receiving means-tested benefit would be eligible for the bill support next winter. From 3 million families in the current system to more than 6 million with our proposals, so that 1 in 5 families in Britain would get help with their bills through this scheme, including an additional 900,000 families with children and a total of 1.8 million households in fuel poverty. Because this government is determined to do everything in our power to help people struggling to pay their energy bills and support the most vulnerable in our society. Second, because of our exposure to fossil fuels, the cost of living saw bills rocket to $2,500 and families plunge into unstable debt. Debt which continues to accumulate today. In the system we have inherited, every bill payer pays for managing this debt burden. We are determined to act on behalf of those in debt and all the bill payers who are paying the cost of it. So we are working closely with Ofgem to accelerate proposals on a debt relief scheme that will support households who have built up unsustainable energy debt through the crisis and have no way of paying it. This will be an important first step to cut the cost of servicing bad energy debt, and under these plans, the target would be to reduce the debt allowance paid by all bill payers to pre-crisis levels. Third, we know that one of the best answers to high bills is upgrading homes so they are cheaper to run. So we will shortly be announcing details of around £500 million of funding under the Warm Homes Local Grant and £1.3 billion under the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund to invest in home upgrades over the coming years and cut fuel poverty. In all, up to 300,000 households will benefit from upgrades in the next financial year through our Warm Homes plan, whether it's new installation, double glazing, a heat pump, roof solar panels. That's more than double the number supported in the last financial year. And we're going to ensure that landlords invest in energy efficiency upgrades that will make homes warmer and bring down the cost for tenants, lifting up to 1 million people out of fuel poverty, so that we are doing everything that we can to ensure people have the security of a home they can afford to heat. Fourth, we are clear that we need a regulator that fights for consumers. That is why we have called on Ofgem to use its powers to the maximum to protect consumers, challenging unlawful back billing, taking action on inaccurate bills, driving smart meter rollout, giving every family the option of a zero standing charge tariff so they have more choice in how they pay for their energy, and ensuring compensation is given for wrongful installation of prepayment meters. And we are moving forward on our review of Ofgem to ensure it has the powers that it needs to stand up for consumers and clamp down on poor behaviour by energy companies. Now, this set of measures, Madam Deputy Speaker, shows a government willing to use all the powers at our disposal to help protect consumers. But, important as these measures are, I must stress to the House there is no proper solution to rising energy bills while this country remains exposed to the rollercoaster of fossil fuel markets. And that is why this government is moving at speed to deliver clean power. Lifting the onshore ban in England, consenting nearly 3 gigawatts of solar, setting up Great British Energy, delivering record-breaking renewable auction, making it easier to build the next generation of new nuclear power stations, and getting on with the job of implementing the reforms to the planning system, grid, renewable auctions set out in our Clean Power Action Plan. And look, I have to report to the House, however, that despite the importance of this mission, despite the fact that we are running at it, we continue to receive representation from parties opposite not to speed up, but to slow down. Reject solar power, reject onshore wind, reject offshore wind, reject new transmission infrastructure, representations that, if we accepted, would leave us more vulnerable, more insecure, and the British people paying the price. And let me tell the House, we will reject those representations. We know that every solar panel we put up, every wind turbine we build, every piece of transmission infrastructure we construct makes us more secure. And every time the party opposite opposes these measures, they double down on their legacy of leaving this country exposed and the British people deeply vulnerable. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will do whatever it takes to stand up for working people now and in the future, protecting families and businesses from the consequences of global events, driving forward on our plans to bring down bills for good, and doing everything in our power to support those most in need. I commend the statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Minister Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for advance sight of her statement. Today, the Government has announced an expansion of the Warm Homes discount, a change to the criteria which will see more low-income households receive a £150 payment to heat their homes. But for many, this payment will be immediately eaten up by the increase in the energy price cap. We must be clear. The best protection for vulnerable households is to prioritise cheap energy. The announcement today is, frankly, a sticking plaster approach to rising energy bills. This government fails to grasp the core issue. Our energy costs in this country are far too high for businesses, for industry and, of course, for bill payers. When the energy price cap rose in 2022, the now Secretary of State called it a national emergency. He called for an urgent freeze on energy bills. He called it a lack of leadership. Now in government, the only thing he's able to freeze is vulnerable pensioners by taking away their winter fuel allowance with no notice. Does she think this shows leadership? I know that my constituents, and presumably hers too, will be concerned about their bills rising, concerned about inflation creeping back up, hitting 3% in January, despite the hard work done last year to bring it under control, and angry that Labour's promise to cut bills by £300 is being broken. But the worst part of all this, Mr. Speaker, is that this government, led by ideological zealotry from the Secretary of State, is doubling down. Their obsession with going further and faster than any country in the world to meet their own self-imposed 2030 target is going to increase people's bills even further. The renewables industry has warned that their rush to build record renewables in the next 5 years will push up prices and I quote, consumers will lose out. The government's rush to build twice as much grid in the next 5 years as has been built in the last decade will increase the network costs on people's bills. And the OBR has said that the environmental levies will increase to £14 billion in 2030, largely driven by the hidden cost of renewables, all of which will end up on people's energy bills. The Labour Party were not honest about their promise to cut bills by £300 during the election. They were not honest about their plan to take the winter fuel payment away from millions of pensioners living in poverty. And now they are not being honest with the British people about what their plans will do to our energy bills. If there is anything we have learnt over the last few years, it's that the cost of energy is absolutely critical to any modern economy. We cannot go on following ideology over evidence and putting political targets ahead of what will cut the cost of energy in this country. But this government is in denial. That's why they scrapped the Fuel System Cost Analysis commissioned when we were in office. I have to ask the Minister, when will proposals for a debt relief scheme be published? Can she confirm how much she expects levies to increase over the next 5 years? Will she commission a fuel systems cost analysis of what the 2030 target will do to people's energy bills? And will she confirm how much bills will rise by before we see the £300 off what we were all promised?
Minister.